Hello, and welcome back to First Chapter Friday. Do you know one of the things that I love about books is when I find a really good book, and really good book means different things to different people, but when I find one, I can disappear into it. And I have all my life used that as a way to give myself a break from reality when reality feels overwhelming or when I don't like the reality that I'm stuck in. So for example, right now, if I want to travel or go outside or see friends, it's not the same, but it's a way for me to do that and to get away from, being in the same place all of the time. And so one of the types of books that does that for me is something called urban fantasy. So there's some books, fantasy books, that, are set in a very different world. It's not meant to be Earth. There's all sorts of creatures and people there that we don't have in our real world. And so those would be books like the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit and stuff like that. But there's also a type of book where it suggests that there's more going on in our world than we are able to see and engage with all of the time, but that there is fantastical things in our world. So Harry Potter would be an example of that there's this whole magical world that we don't know about. There's a Canadian author called Charles DeLint. I'm sure I will tell you about some of his books eventually. He writes about that kind of thing. And so the book that I'm going to tell you about today is one of those books, and it is called The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. You may have heard of Neil Gaiman. Several of his books have actually been turned into miniseries or TV series. He wrote American Gods and he wrote Good Omens. He also has lots of stories that have been made into movies. He wrote Coraline, for example. And so if you're familiar with any of those, also Stardust is another one of his that is a great book and a great movie if you're looking for more movies to watch. And so he wrote The Ocean at the End of the Lane. It is set in Sussex, England, and the story is about a gentleman he's fully adult. He's 40 years old, and he's returned to his hometown because of a funeral. And when he's there, he's forced to confront memories of something that happened to him when he was a little boy, when he was 7. And he went through this crazy experience that was so remarkable and so out of the ordinary that his brain repressed it and he completely forgot it. And then he works back through it. And the way he works back through it is by telling us the story of what happened. So the back of the book says, Sussex, England. A middle-aged man returns to his childhood home to attend a funeral. Although the house he lived in is long gone, he is drawn to the farm at the end of the road, where, when he was 7, he encountered the most remarkable girl, Letty Hemstock, and her mother and grandmother. He hasn't thought of Letty in decades, and yet, as he sits by the pond, a pond which she'd claimed was an ocean, behind the ramshackle old farmhouse, the unremembered past comes flooding back. And it is a past too strange, too frightening, too dangerous to have happened to anyone, let alone a small boy. 40 years earlier, a man committed suicide in a stolen car at this farm at the end of the road. Like a fuse on a firework, his death lit a touch paper and resonated in unimaginable ways. The darkness was unleashed, something scary and thoroughly incomprehensible to a little boy. And Letty, magical, comforting, wise beyond her years, promised to protect him no matter what. And so it's written almost like a fairy tale or a fable. And like the old style fairy tales and fables, it confronts the darkness in the world and the bad things that happen. And it doesn't sugarcoat them, and it doesn't treat the reader like the reader can't handle it. And that was one of the things that I really loved about this book is the first time I read it, I was going through something pretty rough, and it really helped me work through that and think about how I wanted the world to be and how I wanted to be in the world. So I'm going to read to you the quote and then the preface and the first part of the book. I remember my own childhood vividly. I knew terrible things, but I knew I mustn't let adults know I knew. It would scare them. Maurice Sendak, in conversation with Art Spiegelman, The New Yorker, September 27th, 1993. The Ocean at the End of the Lane. It was only a duck pond out at the back of the farm. It wasn't very big. Letty Hemstock said it was an ocean, but I knew that was silly. She said they'd come here across the ocean from the old country. Her mother said that Letty didn't remember properly and that it was a long time ago and anyway the old country had sunk. Old Mrs. Hemstock, Letty's grandmother, said they were both wrong and that the place that had sunk wasn't the really old country. She said she could remember the really old country. She said the really old country had blown up. Prologue. I wore a black suit and a white shirt, a black tie and black shoes, all polished and shiny, clothes that normally would make me feel uncomfortable, as if I were in a stolen uniform or pretending to be an adult. Today they gave me comfort of a kind. I was wearing the right clothes for a hard day. I had done my duty in the morning, spoken the words I was meant to speak, and I meant them as I spoke them. And then, when the service was done, I got in my car and I drove randomly, without a plan, with an hour or so to kill before I met more people I had not seen for years and shook more hands and drank too many cups of tea from the best china. I drove along winding Sussex country roads I only half remembered, until I found myself headed toward the town centre. So I turned randomly down another road and took a left and a right. It was only then that I realized where I was going, where I had been going all along, and I grimaced at my own foolishness. I had been driving toward a house that had not existed for decades. I thought of turning around then as I drove down a wide street that had once been a flint lane beside a barley field, of turning back and leaving the past undisturbed. But I was curious. The old house, the one I had lived in for 7 years, from when I was 5 until I was 12, that house had been knocked down and was lost for good. The new house, the one my parents had built at the bottom of the garden, between the azalea bushes and the green circle in the grass we called the fairy ring, that had been sold 30 years ago. I slowed the car as I saw the new house. It would always be the new house in my head. I pulled up into the driveway, observing the way they had built out on the mid-70s architecture. I'd forgotten that the bricks of the house were chocolate brown. The new people had made my mother's tiny balcony into a 2-story sunroom. I stared at the house, remembering less than I had expected about my teenage years. No good times, no bad times. I'd lived in that place for a while as a teenager. It didn't seem to be any part of who I was now. I backed the car out of the driveway. It was time, I knew, to drive to my sister's bustling, cheerful house, all tidied and stiff for the day. I would talk to people whose existence I had forgotten years before, and they would ask me about my marriage, failed a decade ago, a relationship that had slowly frayed until eventually, as they always seem to, it broke. And whether I was seeing anyone. I wasn't. I was not even sure that I could, not yet. And they would ask about my children, all grown up. They have their own lives. They wish they could be here today. Work, doing fine, thank you, I would say, never knowing how to talk about what I do. If I could talk about it, I would not have to do it. I make art. Sometimes I make true art, and sometimes it fills the empty places in my life. Some of them, not all. We would talk about the departed. We would remember the dead. The little country lane of my childhood had become a black tarmac road that served as a buffer between 2 sprawling housing estates. I drove further down it, away from the town, which was not the way I should have been traveling, and it felt good. The slick black road became narrower, windier, became the single-lane track I remembered from my childhood, became packed earth and knobbly bone-like flints. Soon I was driving, slowly, bumpily, down a narrow lane with brambles and briar roses on each side, wherever the edge was not a stand of hazels or a wild hedgerow. I felt like I had driven back in time. That lane was how I remembered it, when nothing else was. I drove past Caraway Farm. I remembered being just 16 and kissing red-cheeked, fair-haired Callie Anders, who lived there, and whose family would soon move to the Shetlands, and I would never kiss her or see her again. Then nothing but fields on either side of the road for almost a mile, a tangle of meadows. Slowly, the lane became a track. I was reaching its end. I remembered it before I turned the corner and saw it, in all its dilapidated red brick glory, the Hemstock's farmhouse. It took me by surprise, although that was where the lane had always ended. I could have gone no further. I parked the car at the side of the farmyard. I had no plan. I wondered whether, after all these years, there was anyone still living there, or, more precisely, if the Hemstocks were still living there. It seemed unlikely, but then from what little I remembered, they had been unlikely people. The stench of cow muck struck me as I got out of the car, and I walked gingerly across the small yard to the front door. I looked for a doorbell in vain, and then I knocked. The door had not been latched properly, and it swung gently open as I rapped it with my knuckles. I had been here, hadn't I, a long time ago? I was sure I had. Childhood memories are sometimes covered and obscured beneath the things that come later, like childhood toys forgotten at the bottom of a crammed adult closet, but they're never lost for good. I stood in the hallway and called, "Hello? Is anybody there?" I heard nothing. I smelled bread baking and wax furniture polish and old wood. My eyes were slow to adjust to the darkness. I peered into it and was getting ready to turn and leave when an elderly woman came out of the dim hallway holding a white duster. She wore her gray hair long. I said, "Mrs. Hemstock?" She tipped her head to one side and looked at me. "Yes, I do know you, young man," she said. "I am not a young man, not any longer." "I know you, but things get messy when you get to be my age. Who are you exactly?" "I think I must have been about 7, maybe 8, last time I was here." She smiled then. "You were Letty's friend from the top of the lane. You gave me milk. It was warm from the cows." And then I realized how many years had gone by, and I said, "No, you didn't do that. That must have been your mother who gave the milk. I'm sorry." As we age, we become our parents, live long enough, and we see faces repeated in time. I remembered Mrs. Hemstock, Letty's mother, as a stout woman. This woman was stick-thin, and she looked delicate. She looked like her mother, like the woman I had known as old Mrs. Hemstock. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see my father's face, not my own, and I remember the way he would smile at himself in mirrors before he went out. "Looking good," he'd say to his reflection approvingly. "Looking good." "Are you here to see Letty?" Mrs. Hemstock asked. "Is she here?" The idea surprised me. She'd gone somewhere, hadn't she? America? The old woman shook her head. "I was just about to put the kettle on. Do you fancy a spot of tea?" I hesitated. Then I said that if she didn't mind, I'd like it if she could point me toward the duck pond first. Duck pond? I knew Letty had a funny name for it. I remembered that. She called it the sea, something like that. The old woman put the cloth down on the dresser. "Can't drink the water from the sea, can you? Too salty, like drinking life's blood. Do you remember the way? You can get to it around the side of the house. Just follow the path." If you'd asked me an hour before, I would have said no, I did not remember the way. I do not even think I would have remembered Letty Hemstock's name. But standing in that hallway, it was all coming back to me. Memories were waiting at the edges of things, beckoning to me. Had you told me that I was 7 again, I might have half believed you for a moment. Thank you. I walked into the farmyard. I went past the chicken coop, past the old barn, and along the edge of the field, remembering where I was and what was coming next, and exulting in the knowledge. Hazels linked the side of the meadow. I picked a handful of the green nuts and put them in my pocket. The pond is next, I thought. I just have to go around this shed and I'll see it. I saw it and felt oddly proud of myself, as if that one active memory had blown away some of the cobwebs of the day. The pond was smaller than I remembered. There was a little wooden shed on the far side, and by the path, an ancient, heavy, wooden metal bench. The peeling wood slats had been painted green a few years ago. I sat on the bench and stared at the reflection of the sky and the water, at the scum of duckweed on the edges, at the half-dozen lily pads. Every now and again, I tossed a hazelnut into the middle of the pond that Letty Hemstock had called. It wasn't the sea, was it? She would be older than I am now, Letty Hemstock. She was only a handful of years older than I was back then for all her funny talk. She was 11. What was I? It was after the bad birthday party. I knew that, so I would have been 7. I wondered if we'd ever fallen in the water. Had I pushed her into the duck pond, the strange girl who lived in the farm at the very bottom of the lane? I remembered her being in the water. Perhaps she had pushed me in too. Where did she go? America? No, Australia, that was it, somewhere a long way away. And it wasn't the sea, it was the ocean. Letty Hemstock's ocean. I remembered that. And remembering that, I remembered everything. That is how the story opens. So if you're feeling like maybe you would like to get lost in an ocean at the end of a lane, if you like stories with adventure and some darkness and people really struggling for something that matters, and you're okay with some fantasy and some things that are difficult to explain, then you might like The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Thanks for listening.